Hi team, welcome back. This is the third part of Chapter 7, Climate and Vegetation. We've already covered the intro section as well as the A climates, the B climates, and the C climates. So now it's time to move on to the D climates. So there are two varieties of D climates. They're both referred to as severe mid-latitude climates or sometimes microthermal because of the cold winter temperatures experienced there. So the two varieties are humid continental and subarctic. So of course we'll start with humid continental, but we'll also take a look at the map. Find these. So humid continental, they go by the Köppen symbols DFA, DFB, DWA, DWB. So usually upper mid latitudes with either moisture throughout the year or a winter drying period. And the summers can get quite hot in some of these places. I want you to think about New York, Chicago, or maybe Beijing, China. So these are usually found on the east sides of continents between 35 and 55 degrees latitude, thereabouts, only in the northern hemisphere. There are no D climates at all in the southern hemisphere. Here we get significant rainfall. 20 to 50 inches of rainfall per year would not be abnormal. And that means about the same as the amount we will get in Glendale on average, up to about 2.5 times that amount. Now here, instead of just having the rainfall in the winter though, we're getting rainfall either again throughout the year or with a slight winter dry period. Those winters, by the way, are bitterly cold, very, very cold winters. But the summers can be either very, very warm or even quite hot. So they have a very large annual temperature range. The difference between the average temperature of the summer, the warmest month of the summer, and the average temperature of the coldest winter month. The difference between those, the ATR, can be quite large. So summers can have, well, mean temperatures over 50 degrees. That means, yeah, well, it might be in the 80s or 90s in the daytime, and it might be cooling down possibly into the 50s at nighttime, into the 40s even. Winter usually has an average temperature below 27 degrees Fahrenheit. So very, very chilly, and that gives a propensity for some very cold mornings, very cold days, and overall pretty cold months. If you've been to New York in January, you know what I'm talking about. And if you've been to Chicago in January, you definitely know what I'm talking about. Here we see the associated biome as a temperate mixed forest. We've seen that same biome before. So the biome spreads well beyond the boundaries of the climate zones. Remember that temperate mixed forest is that mix of both deciduous and evergreen trees. So the map I promised, the humid subtropical, sorry, the humid continental climates are over here in North America, northeast corner. Some of them throughout central Eurasia and the northeast corner of Eurasia. You notice there are none in the southern hemisphere. And the reason is we don't have big chunks of continent like we do in the northern hemisphere down in the southern hemisphere between about 35 and 55 degrees latitude. That's not there. The second type of climate we have here is the subarctic, this darker blue color, and we get those in northern Canada and northern Eurasia. Not quite all the way to the northern border because we'll see later that's where we get tundra climates. So that's where we see the subarctic. Again, humid continental. An example, Chicago, Illinois. And I'm going to, hopefully this will blank me out of here. I'm hoping you can see this, but basically we see quite a bit difference between the summertime and wintertime temperatures. That's giving us a very large annual temperature range, that difference between the warmest and coldest. Rainfall, significant rainfall throughout the year, so it's a pretty moist environment. Cold, slightly drier, but cold and still wet in the winter, and warm and moist, so very humid in the summertime. So if you've been to Chicago in the summertime, you definitely need air conditioning. It's kind of humid and quite warm. But in the wintertime, very chilly, often quite windy, and still some moisture in the air, but really bitterly cold. Again, the type of vegetation is the temperate mixed forests, And just as a reminder, we do have some variation between areas that get more deciduous trees and areas that get more evergreen trees. So if we were to look at the northeast portion of the USA, within this humid continental area, we seem to have quite a lot of deciduous trees and they lose their leaves in the wintertime. So the subarctic is the last of the D climates. And these climate types, again, upper mid latitudes that are wet throughout the year or have that winter dry period. But these are totally absent in the southern hemisphere, like all D climates, and dominated by North America and Eurasia, because those are the two big land masses we have at these latitudes. We'll start to see rainfall diminish, 5 inches to 20 inches of rain. That's almost desert-like in some conditions, but remember here we don't see very much evapotranspiration, so that's plenty of moisture at these latitudes to sustain forests. Now most of this moisture is going to fall in the form of summer precipitation, summer rainfall, but we get really, really cold winters, so we get substantial amounts of snowfall in the winter. Now, if you were to have bitterly cold winters and pretty mild to warm summers, you're going to have a pretty large range in your annual temperature range. You're going to see quite a bit of difference between the average summertime temperature and the average wintertime temperature. And it's those wintertime cold temperatures that really account for this being the place in the world or the region in the world with the largest annual temperature range. So this again would be like central Canada or maybe Siberia in Eurasia. Very, very cold winters. So underlined here, largest annual temperature ranges in the world. That's probably important in a couple of weeks. Now the biome we have associated with these is referred to as the boreal forest biome. Boreal just means northern. So we got the northern forests. And sometimes call these the coniferous forests, not carnivorous, but coniferous. So conifers, trees that bear cones, like pine cones and fir cones and spruce cones. So fir trees, pine trees, spruce, etc. So in the subarctic climate, look at this, some pretty mild summertime temperatures, but bitterly cold winter temperatures. And that difference gives them the largest annual temperature range in the world. In this case, a portion of Siberia, 115 degrees Fahrenheit difference between the average summer and the average winter temperatures. Looks beautiful in this picture. That would be probably in the June, July, August period, because pretty soon afterwards we fall into frozen temperatures and this lake would be frozen. And if you were there, you'd probably be frozen too. So this is a oblique aerial shot of a coniferous forest, those boreal forests, sometimes called taiga. And in this case, we're seeing basically cone-bearing trees of all kinds. And this would be like a endless sea of Christmas trees. So we only find these in this kind of abundance in the boreal forests associated with the subarctic climate types, so the DFD, DFCs, etc. So mostly, in fact, exclusively evergreens. It's just too cold for deciduous trees to exist there. And you think about that, if you've ever cut down a pine tree or you've seen the remnants of that firewood from a pine tree, it has a very, very thick bark on that, which helps to protect that tree. And many, if not most, deciduous trees don't have a bark layer quite like that. So some trees have adapted to survive these very cold winters, others have not, and it seems like the spruce and fir and pine and larch, they have definitely found a way to survive in this very, very harsh environment. Not much precipitation, again, less than 10 inches. It sounds like a desert if it was in the tropics or subtropics, but because we're at the higher latitudes, we don't have as much evapotranspiration, and therefore 10 inches of moisture hangs around. There's plenty to feed those forests. Now, from the boreal forest, if you went further north, you'd be out of the forest and into the tundra. If you went further south, remember, these are only in the northern hemisphere. So if you went further south, you'd exit the boreal forest and go into the mixed forest under most circumstances. There are local variations. Now the forest floor gets this constant carpet of the fallen needle leaves. So think about little pine tree needles or pine needles. They fall down to the forest floor. They don't decay very quickly. So the forest floor builds up with this layer of slowly decomposing, very acidic needles from those trees. Not many things can really eat those needles. They don't seem very nutritious, but some animals have adapted to eat just the leaves from pine trees, amongst other things. Maybe a moose comes to mind in its ability to do that. So some of the wildlife that we would get here would be the moose, and then things that eat moose, things like bears and wolves. There are other things that can eat some of the fruits of these trees. Well, think about that. A pine tree, you're not going to eat the leaves so much as a human. You're not going to eat the pine cones so much. You're not going to eat the wood. Other things will. Insects certainly will. But if you've ever looked at a pine cone when it opens up, inside those little nuts, those pine seeds, those are very nutritious. And maybe think about a natural source there for pesto. So there's a lot of goodies in there. So a lot of animals, like squirrels and chipmunks, they'll make a meal out of those. So yes, there are some calories to be drawn from those trees, just not in the typical ways we always think about. So again, we're looking at this biome, the great northern forest, the boreal forest, the taiga, coniferous forests. I like to call that the 1986 Nissan Sentra teal color, and same over here in Siberia. So northernmost Eurasia, or northern Eurasia, not northernmost, my apologies. We got some tundra up here. This is what it looks like in the coniferous forest, so cone-bearing trees with those needly-like structures, all kinds of varieties here. And you might notice that you might say to yourself, hey, I've seen something like this before, yet I've never been to central Canada. I've never been to Siberia. And we'll get to that in a moment, but you might be thinking here, instead of Canada, you might be thinking Big Bear or Mammoth or Tahoe. And there's a reason for that we'll get to in just a second. So the last of our climates, of our official A, B, C, D, E climates in the Köppen system, are the polar climates. We're going to discuss two polar climates. They're both E climates. In the Köppen system, E means polar, but we have ET, polar tundra, and EF, polar ice cap. So first of all, the ET climate zones. That means that for 1, 2, 3, possibly 4 months, the average temperature is going to be over 32 degrees Fahrenheit. It doesn't get above 50 on average, but it will get above 32, which means that things start to thaw out, like we see in this picture right here. On the other hand, we have the EF climates, the polar ice cap, where even the warmest month is below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and therefore things don't really thaw out. And therefore, we're not going to see too much of a biome associated with it. In both cases, we see low precipitation because, remember, cold air can't hold much moisture. So the polar climates, again, the polar tundra we find towards the coastlines up at very high latitude, where the ice caps we're going to see removed from the coastlines, so more interior. Again, even with Eurasia, we've got northern coast tundra, the ice caps, in this case in Greenland, and we get ice caps in Antarctica too. So those are the coldest of the cold places. So the tundra climates, again, they seem to be along the coasts, pretty dry by most standards, less than 10 inches of precipitation, but that 10 inches of precipitation is plenty when you don't have very much evapotranspiration. Most of that is falling in the form of snow. Very brief summers, 1, 2, 3, or 4 months, where it thaws out for a little while, and if it thaws out, things can start growing. So the sunlight is also going to be up, albeit at a low angle, for up to 24 hours per day during those summer months. But then come the long, cold, dark winters lasting, 8, 9, 10, 11 months. That would be something you have to adapt to in order to survive. These areas of tundra are also associated with permafrost. That means that all year round, if you dig down about 2 feet to 3 feet below the ground, so you're into the soil about 3 feet, from there on down, the water in the soil is permanently frozen. We call that permafrost. However, the upper 1, 2, or 3 feet, that's going to absorb energy from the atmosphere and also from the sun, of course. So basically, that upper 2, 3 feet can thaw out in the summertime and freeze up for the rest of the year. Thaw out in the summertime, freeze up for the rest of the year. And if it's on a slope at all, when it thaws out, the soil can actually start migrating downhill, creating something we call soil effluxion lobes, but that's for another day. And one easy association here, the tundra climate zone, the ET tundra climate zone, is associated with the tundra biome. By the way, this is what the tundra biome looks like. Lots of low-growing plants. It's nowhere near enough time for things taller than a foot or so could grow. But we're going to concentrate on the atmosphere right here. Here we see the temperatures getting above the freezing point for a couple months in the summertime and then zooming back down into frozen temperatures. Not much in the way of total precipitation, 5 inches here. Not an awful lot, but not a lot of evapotranspiration going on. Again, the tundra biome. See a lot of these kind of orangey yellow colors from the grasses and sedges and lichen, something we'll discuss in just a second. That's the stuff that kind of grows on the sides of rocks quite readily. You might have seen that in certain mountainous environments in Southern California, kind of orangey yellow, red colors. So the tundra biome is really consisting of very short growing plants like sedges, grasses, moss, lichen. The soil is relatively thin. Now these things are going to bloom for just that 1, 2, 3, 4 months and then die off very quickly again. It's too cold for trees to exist, so there's no trees in that area of the tundra, so to speak. Now the animals, of course, they're going to have to either move into or migrate into the tundra biome when the food is abundant, and then they quickly migrate out, or they're going to have to fatten up and then hibernate for many, many, many months. Some animals that do this, caribou or reindeer, they will migrate in and migrate out. The Arctic fox can be there year-round. Mosquitoes are going to lay dormant in the water, and that's one important thing here. Lots of stagnant water, because as things thaw out on the surface, that the ice will turn to water, and it will try to infiltrate downwards, but the ice won't let it go any further. So it sort of stays in an upper 1, 2, 3 feet and provides a very soggy environment. Well, during that 1, 2, 3, or 4 months, during the summer months, that water houses lots of mosquitoes being born from their larvae and then flying out, laying eggs, completing a life cycle themselves. So lots and lots and lots of mosquitoes out here. So again, that biome is up on the northern shore of North America and the north shore of Eurasia, very high latitude facing the Arctic Ocean. So depending on what time of year you go, it looks a little different. This will be what it would look like in late fall or maybe early spring, and things start to thaw out a little bit. And then all those little low plants with all the nutrients in them attracting all the animals that will migrate in and then migrate out before it goes back to a wintertime environment. Now the ice caps are very last of the standard Köppen climate types, the EF climate. Warmest month is below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, so it never really thaws out. Now that's the warmest it could possibly get, right? We're looking at temperatures that are pretty consistently minus 20 to minus 50 during the coldest months. Very low precipitation, 1 to 5 inches. Again, very cold air can hold very little moisture, but there is some, and that moisture comes out all in the form of snow, about 1 to 5 inches per year. The examples would be found on ice caps and glaciers like in Greenland and Antarctica. Now there's no biome or no land biome associated with this, because if it's frozen throughout the year, plants are not going to grow, and plants are the basis of the food chain on the land. So no plants, no food. You might think, well, I've seen videos of Antarctica. I've seen all kinds of stuff. Think about penguins and the seal population down there, killer whales, etc. But keep in mind, all of the food that they consume down there is coming from a marine habitat, not from a land habitat. And we're focusing here on the biomes of the land. Ice cap examples here in Antarctica. Remember, this is southern hemisphere now. So coldest temperatures, June, July, August in this realm here. And this is equating to about minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. And a nice warm temperature as we get into June and July. As we get into December and January, we're looking at temperatures of about 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Keep in mind, that's still below freezing because the freezing point is 32 Fahrenheit. So this remains frozen throughout the year. But those cold temperatures, chilly. You would not want to be there during the height of winter in probably July, August in Antarctica. For Northern Hemisphere example, we're looking at central Greenland over here, and we're looking here at a warm summertime temperature of around 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Remember, summer, average, 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Wintertime, well, let's see what's going on over here. Say February over here, we're looking at, for February, temperatures of minus 50. Very interesting. And we're getting some moisture in late August, September, October, November, December. So we're getting some of those wintertime storms. But also, once the hurricanes of the Atlantic break up, some of that moisture might go all the way towards Greenland. So still, total precipitation here, about 4 inches. One thing I didn't point out for Antarctica, by the way, right over here, for this portion of Antarctica, 0 precipitation. That air is so cold and so removed from storm tracks that basically it's not been known to precipitate in some areas of Antarctica, in particular the McMurdo Dry Basin. So this is what a ice cap climate might look like. Nothing really growing on there. I say nothing, we have to be careful because there are some microorganisms that we can find in these areas over here. Once the sun beats down on them, even little areas could have some bacterial action going on, but that's not what we're mapping out. Now the last climate, remember A, B, C, D, E, we also recognize a climate type known as the highland climate. Now Köppen had realized that in the A, B, C, D, E climates, that latitude was a dominant factor in determining where those climates would be located. And think about that. A is tropical, the B's are largely subtropical, C's are lower mid-latitude, D is upper mid-latitude, E is polar. So as we go A, B, C, D, E, we're moving from the equator towards the poles. However, if the land sticks up high enough into the troposphere, we can find ice caps, we can find tundra, almost anywhere on the planet. It's just that the land has to be high enough. For example, there is permanent ice at the equator in New Guinea, the island of New Guinea, Papua, the same island, but the Indonesian portion of that. Also in Ecuador, so very close to the equator, if land sticks up over 16,000 feet high, we would have permanent ice. And it would be kind of ludicrous to say, well, that's a tropical climate right there. So what we've come up with is a system where we say, if the land sticks up high enough so that the land becomes the dominant reason why that climate exists in an area, we just refer to that as a highland climate. So most significant mountain chains in the world would be mapped out with a big giant H for their climate type. They're showing you that the presence of those mountains is dominating the type of climate and therefore the biome associated with that. For instance, in Canada, we would expect to find a coniferous forest, a northern forest, a boreal forest, but we get the exact same thing in Guatemala within the tropics, because in this case, this is in part of a mountain system of Guatemala. So the land sticks up high enough, it can mimic the changes you would expect in latitude. This diagram is showing pretty much the same thing. At the same latitude, you could have, let's say this is the eastern portion of the Sierra Nevada in California. Of course, the vertical limit is exaggerated here. But let's say if you're driving up Highway 395 towards Mammoth Lakes, you would have a desert environment. You go up the slope enough and you get into a sagebrush environment. Go up even higher and you're getting into the equivalent of a mixed forest. You go up even higher, you're getting up into the alpine version of a coniferous forest, so dominated by cone-bearing trees. And then go even higher and the trees, they dip away. No more trees anymore above the tree line. We're in a tundra-like environment, and keep going up even further. There's nothing. There's no living elements up here in some of these permanent ice caps. So that's just like going from in this case, a B to a C to a D to an E climate without changing your latitude. Instead, you're changing your altitude or elevation. And we refer to these different zones that are established with different elevation as zones of vertical vegetation. Again, Costa Rica, tundra. Where in Canada, we'd expect to see that tundra, that low growing plants. So this is just higher elevation or high elevation in Costa Rica. Also, you might have a desert environment, such as this, with a waterway running right through it, giving you lots of greenery on the sides of that waterway. Well, that's a very interesting scenario. If you were just taking a photograph right here, you would not consider that to be a desert environment. And you'd be actually absolutely right. We have these modifications to each environment where waterways run through, making moisture available to plants that would not otherwise be so. For instance, here's a pretty dry environment with vegetation growing along the sides here. And this vegetation could be there year-round if the waterway is there year-round. So we refer to vegetation growing alongside a waterway, like a river, as riparian vegetation. We can see different elements of that with permanent running water or water that runs for part of the year or most of the year or some of the year, and that will impact the type of vegetation you get in those riparian environments. One of the last concepts we're going to look at here is a concept of how vegetation will change over time. Everything we've looked at, all of the biomes, we've shown you what should be there. What is the natural vegetation for that area? But of course, if you look at New York or Chicago, we don't see that vegetation because we've paved over stuff. We've built schools, we've built communities, we've built roads, dams, etc. So what we've looked at is what really should be there in its natural configuration, but of course we've seen some modification to that. There's a whole class that you could take called Human Impact on the Environment, Geography 106, that allows you to look at what humans have done to natural environments over time, and it'll be well worth taking a look at that when it's offered next. Now, one of the concepts we're looking at here is that not only have humans have impacts, but there are also natural impacts to vegetation. So you could get a very healthy biome, and in certain areas of that biome or certain communities, maybe a fire rages through and just burns everything away. Or maybe there's a landslide, or maybe a flood, or some other natural disaster. In those cases, we end up by obliterating most of the vegetation. Now, we will then see a subsequent change over time as plants in particular have to compete for available space. So plants are competing for space to put their roots, to get the nutrients, to suck up the water, but also for sunlight. And there are other elements that come into play, but a plant will definitely need the sunlight, need the nutrients, need the anchor from the roots, need the moisture, etc. And after disturbance, the first plants to grow up or to grow back in an area of disturbance are referred to as the pioneer species, or this is referred to as a pioneer stage. So a pioneer species or a pioneer stage, the first ones to grow up. And normally those plants have a lot of nutrients and not growing too tall, and that's going to attract a lot of wildlife, a lot of rabbits and squirrels and snakes and birds and things of that nature. So we have a pretty vibrant system going on at that point. Over time, that's slowly going to change because there are other plants that will outcompete these. And what it's going to do is allow larger or taller growing plants to outcompete those first plants. Now, there's going to be room for all of them for a few years. Some of the shorter growing plants, some of the taller growing plants, they grow taller, but they take longer to do so. And then some bushes come into play. Some of the trees that were burned prior to the fire, let's say, had their seeds crack open during that fire. And after a few years, they're getting tall enough to get some of the sunlight. So within a few years, you can get a very diverse ecosystem. Some short growing plants, different varieties of those, medium and taller growing plants, and again, different varieties of each. And each of those species might have a particular animal that likes to thrive on them or nest in them or eat their foods. Given about, let's say in our local environment in Southern California, given about 15 to 20 years after disturbance, we have a pretty healthy ecosystem, attracting a lot of hawks and snakes and coyotes and deer and rabbits, etc. Now, if we wait any longer than that, we're going to get in an area where some of the slowest growing plants are now starting to outcompete some of those faster but shorter plants. Also, some particular plants in our own environment, a plant called chamise has the ability to actually put phytotoxins or plant toxins into the soil. And what that will do is outcompete some of the other plants. So if it can put the toxins into the soil, it will mean that other large growing plants are at a disadvantage. And more chamise can start to grow because it's not completely immune, but it's more immune to those same poisons than others. As time progresses, we get a lot more tall plants and a lot fewer of the short plants. And that means that some of the animals that thrive on the shorter plants are no longer coming into the area. So we get less rabbits, less coyote, less snakes, less hawks, less birds of many varieties. Not a healthy ecosystem. Now, for thousands of years, the Native Americans in our own local mountains, they observed this, and what they would do is they would burn the forest down. They would burn these ecosystems down about every 20 years or so. Not the whole forest, of course, but portions of it. And that would attract new animals back the next time that we saw the rains. So if we burn everything away, it's basically allowing the system to rejuvenate and start again. We can see the same kind of system going on. If we have a disturbance from a landslide, given enough time, we go from this pioneer stage to the last stage, which we refer to as the mature stage. Some people refer to that as the climax community, that mature stage. So always we have to keep in mind that everything we're looking at has a time component to it too. Where are we in that process from the pioneer stage through the mature stage? Okay, that's it for chapter 7. That's the first third of the last section of the class. 2 more chapters to go. Chapter 8, we're going to start looking at the lithosphere, and chapter 9 is where we talk about the processes of plate tectonics and looking at volcanoes and earthquakes and things of that nature. But for now, we just wrapped up the vegetation and climate portion. Time for questions in class, and we'll address those when we meet the next time. Okay, I hope you learned something here today. Bye-bye.